When we say that narcissists thrive on control, what we're really saying is that control is their form of survival. It's the psychological oxygen they breathe. Without it, their entire sense of self begins to collapse. See, a narcissist doesn't live in the same emotional world as most people. Their identity isn't rooted in truth, but in image. They don't build a self, they construct a performance. And control over you, over the situation, over the narrative, is what keeps that performance believable, both to you and to themselves. A narcissist's need for control begins with their own fear of insignificance. Deep down, there's this haunting sense that they don't matter unless they dominate the emotional landscape of others. That's why they seek constant validation. But validation alone isn't enough. It has to come through power, through manipulation, through making you react. Because every reaction, every emotional outburst, but every moment of confusion, those are signals to them that they still have you under their influence. Think of it this way: every time you explain yourself to a narcissist who's twisting your words, you're not communicating, you're feeding. You're feeding their need to feel superior. They don't care about understanding your point. They care about maintaining the illusion that they're the one in charge. And the cruel irony is that the more emotionally intelligent you are, the easier you are to manipulate, because you keep trying to appeal to reason in someone who thrives on chaos. The control a narcissist seeks isn't just external. It's profoundly internal. They must control how they are perceived. This is why they rewrite history. They'll gaslight you, deny what's obvious, and then accuse you of overreacting, all because admitting fault would mean confronting something they fear more than anything: weakness. For a narcissist, weakness equals annihilation. And so they construct a mask, grandiose, flawless, charismatic, but hollow. Their entire identity depends on convincing others that the mask is the person. But here's the paradox: the more control they try to exert, the more fragile they become. Because control is a desperate attempt to hold together a fractured sense of self. When you start to recognize that, you stop taking their behavior personally. You start to see that their manipulation isn't about you. It's about them trying to stabilize an inner world that's falling apart. This is why they fear autonomy in others. A confident, emotionally grounded person terrifies them. Someone who can disagree calmly, who doesn't need their approval, who can walk away without theatrics. That kind of person is dangerous to them. Why? Because it breaks the spell. It exposes the truth. They never had control to begin with. They only had your participation. Psychologically, it's fascinating. Every time you detach emotionally, they lose a piece of their identity, because their sense of power is relational. It exists only when you react. You are unknowingly their mirror. The moment you stop reflecting back their superiority, the illusion begins to crumble. And that's why they lash out when you start setting boundaries. They interpret boundaries not as a healthy act of self-respect, but as rebellion. Because in their mind, your independence is an act of defiance against the empire of their ego. And yet, this is where your real power lies. You don't have to fight for control. You just have to stop giving it away. You don't need to argue, explain, or prove yourself. You simply need to recognize what's happening and choose not to participate in the script they've written for you. Because narcissists aren't strong. They're dependent. Dependent on your emotional energy, your attention, your confusion. Once you withdraw that, their power evaporates. So when I say narcissists thrive on control, understand that their control depends on one thing: your willingness to be controlled. The moment you reclaim your emotional independence, they start to fear you. Not because you've become cruel or dominant, but because you've become untouchable. The ultimate act of strength isn't confrontation, it's detachment. The narcissist's greatest fear isn't exposure, it's irrelevance. When we talk about boundaries destroying manipulation, we're not talking about building walls around your life or cutting people off at the first sign of conflict. Boundaries aren't acts of aggression. They're acts of definition. They say, this is where I end and you begin. And for a narcissist, that line is intolerable because their entire psychological existence depends on blurring it. A narcissist cannot stand boundaries because boundaries threaten their illusion of dominance. They need to believe that your emotions, your reactions, even your sense of identity belong to them, that they can reach into your life, rearrange your truth, and decide what you should think or feel. So when you calmly and consistently assert a boundary, you're not just refusing their control, you're dismantling their psychological structure. What's fascinating is that boundaries aren't loud. They don't require shouting or long explanations. A boundary, when rooted in self-respect, is almost silent. It's calm. It's neutral. And that calmness is what terrifies the narcissist. Because narcissists feed on emotional volatility, your anger, your guilt, your defensiveness. It all gives them energy. The moment you stop reacting, you cut off their supply. They can't manipulate what doesn't engage. Philosophically speaking, boundaries are the outer expression of inner order. They reflect a person who has a stable sense of self, someone who knows their values, their limits, and their worth. A narcissist lacks that internal stability. They live in chaos. So when you introduce order into the dynamic, it confronts them with something unbearable: accountability. And accountability is the one reality they cannot exist within. Because accountability forces them to face the truth that their behavior has consequences, that they are not the center of the universe, that other people have rights equal to theirs. And this is where the transformation begins for you. Setting a boundary isn't about punishing the narcissist. It's about rescuing yourself. It's about teaching your nervous system that it no longer needs to live in survival mode. Every time you say no, without guilt or that doesn't work for me, without justification, you rewire your own mind. You teach it that peace isn't selfish, that self-protection isn't cruelty, and that love without respect isn't love at all. But of course, the moment you start doing this, the narcissist will test you. They'll accuse you of being selfish, cold, or ungrateful. They'll twist your words to make you doubt your reality. And that's precisely the point. Because if they can make you feel guilty, they regain control. That's why your boundaries must be anchored not in emotion, but in principle. You don't defend them with words, you enforce them with action. You don't explain your worth, you embody it. It's a deeply psychological battle, not between you and them, but between your truth and your conditioning. Because many people who attract narcissists grew up believing that love means sacrifice, that harmony requires silence, that being good means pleasing others. But boundaries rewrite that story. They remind you that being good also means being grounded, that compassion doesn't require compliance, and that peace without self-respect is just submission dressed up as love. You'll know your boundaries are working not when the narcissist approves, but when they react. Resistance is a sign that the dynamic is shifting. The old pattern, where you over-explain and they dominate, starts to die. And yes, it's uncomfortable. It feels unnatural at first. But discomfort is often the sign of freedom being born. And here's the deeper truth. Boundaries don't destroy relationships, they reveal them. They expose what's real and what's conditional. When you start living from a place of respect, only those capable of mutual respect will remain. The narcissist may rage, withdraw, or attempt to guilt you back into submission. But over time, as you stay consistent, they realize something they can't tolerate, that you no longer belong to their emotional orbit. So when I say boundaries destroy manipulation, understand that what they really destroy is illusion. They destroy the myth that love must mean surrender, that peace requires silence, that strength equals cruelty. Boundaries replace those lies with something truer, something cleaner: integrity. Because the person who can calmly set a boundary is no longer seeking permission to exist. They already know who they are, and that's exactly why the narcissist fears them. Emotional neutrality is one of the most misunderstood concepts in psychology, and yet it's the single greatest weapon you have against manipulation. Most people think neutrality means indifference, that it's cold, detached, even uncaring. But that's not what it is at all. Emotional neutrality doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you don't feed. It means you can observe without being consumed. And that's precisely what narcissists cannot tolerate: someone who refuses to feed their emotional hunger. Narcissists thrive on extremes. They push you to the edge of anger, of guilt, of confusion, because emotional chaos is how they confirm their power. When you lose control, they gain it. The louder you argue, the calmer they feel. The more desperate you become to prove your innocence or good intentions, the more certain they are that they still own space in your mind. It's a psychological inversion. Their peace is your pain, and your turmoil is their validation. So when you stop reacting, something profound happens. The system they've built, which depends entirely on emotional escalation, collapses. They can't play the role of victim or hero or superior without your participation. Your neutrality removes the mirror they rely on to sustain their delusion of control. Now, to stay neutral in the face of manipulation is not easy. It requires self-awareness, discipline, and a deep understanding of how your emotions are being weaponized against you. Narcissists know exactly how to push your buttons because they installed them. They study your reactions, your vulnerabilities, your need to be seen as good or kind or fair. They'll say things that specifically target your identity. And so, the first step toward emotional neutrality is realizing that their attacks aren't personal. They're strategic. When you begin to understand that, you detach from the emotional bait. You start to see their behavior not as truth, but as a performance. They're not trying to communicate, they're trying to provoke. And once you see that clearly, your calm becomes effortless. You're not repressing your emotions. You're simply choosing not to give them away. This kind of control is rare because it demands something we don't often practice: patience with our own discomfort. When someone attacks us emotionally, our instinct is to defend, to explain, to restore justice. But when you're dealing with a narcissist, justice doesn't exist, only domination. The moment you try to reason with someone who is invested in distortion, you've already lost the argument. The only winning move is disengagement. Philosophically, emotional neutrality is an act of sovereignty. It's the mind saying, "You don't get to dictate my state." It's the realization that your peace of mind is not a reaction to the world. It's a decision within it, and that's a radical idea because it returns authority to you. It says, "I'm no longer living as a reflection of someone else's dysfunction." When you master neutrality, you communicate something narcissists can't stand, that they are irrelevant to your inner life. You become ungovernable. Your silence becomes more powerful than their manipulation because it reveals what they fear most: your independence. They'll escalate at first, because they interpret your calm as a challenge. But when they realize they can no longer provoke a reaction, they'll retreat. Because to them, a person who doesn't react is useless. You've removed their source of fuel. And here's where the real transformation happens. Neutrality doesn't just disarm the narcissist. It heals you. It creates space between the stimulus and your response, and in that space, you rediscover who you are. You start to live from clarity instead of chaos. You start making choices based on values, not fear. You stop trying to win arguments that don't matter. It's in that stillness that you reclaim your dignity. And make no mistake, dignity is the ultimate form of strength. Because it's not given to you, it's chosen. It's the quiet confidence that says, I don't need to prove myself to you. I know who I am. So when you stand before a narcissist and you refuse to react, when you look them in the eye and remain calm while they spin their storm, you're doing more than winning a power struggle. You're teaching your psyche something profound, that you are not defined by the chaos around you, but by the calm within you. And that calm, that unshakable composure, is the one thing they can never control, never imitate, and never take away. The idea that one sentence can flip the dynamic with a narcissist might sound almost too simple. But simplicity is deceptive. In psychology, it's often the smallest shifts in language, the subtle, composed statements, that carry the greatest psychological force. Because words, when delivered from a place of self-awareness, don't just communicate information, they communicate power. And for someone who thrives on control, that kind of grounded self-expression is terrifying. Now, the sentence we've been talking about, you're entitled to your opinion, seems harmless, almost polite. But it's a declaration of psychological independence. It's the linguistic equivalent of walking out of their mental cage. It tells the narcissist, you no longer have the authority to define my reality. And that, for them, is a form of death, because their control depends entirely on one thing: your belief that they get to decide what's true. When you use this sentence, you're not arguing. You're not defending yourself. You're not participating in their emotional game. You're simply acknowledging their perspective without surrendering to it. It's an act of detachment disguised as diplomacy, and that's why it works so effectively. Narcissists depend on emotional entanglement. They speak in ways that force you to respond: accusations, guilt trips, subtle insults wrapped in concern. They throw out hooks designed to pull you back into their frame of reference. You're overreacting. You never listen. I guess I'm always the problem. And for most people, the instinct is to respond, to clarify, to defend, to prove you're not what they say you are. But every time you do that, you reinforce their illusion of authority. You've accepted the premise that they get to define the terms of the conversation. But when you say, you're entitled to your opinion, the entire pattern collapses. Because you've acknowledged their words, but you haven't internalized them. You've stepped outside the psychological battlefield they've built. You're saying, you can think whatever you want, but it no longer governs my state. And to someone addicted to control, that's infuriating. Philosophically, it's fascinating. That one sentence establishes the boundary between subjective and objective reality. It says, your perception isn't the truth, it's merely your lens. And it reclaims your right to define your own meaning. Most people underestimate how revolutionary that is in the context of manipulation. Because manipulation always begins with a corruption of perception. It's about convincing you that your sense of reality is unreliable and that theirs is the only version that counts. By calmly acknowledging their opinion without adopting it, you assert your autonomy at the deepest psychological level. You're no longer seeking validation. You're no longer caught in the reflex of trying to fix their distortion. You've transcended the need for approval from someone who thrives on withholding it. This is not about being smug or dismissive, it's about reclaiming composure. Narcissists are masters at emotional escalation. They'll interpret calm as arrogance, disagreement as disrespect, distance as betrayal. But that's their internal chaos, not yours. When you remain steady, you're holding up a mirror that reflects their dysfunction back to them. You're showing them something they cannot bear to see, their lack of control. And here's what's truly profound. This one sentence doesn't just change how they see you. It changes how you see yourself. Because every time you say it, you reinforce a new identity, one that isn't reactive, one that isn't defined by external judgment, one that stands firmly in truth without aggression. You start to understand that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the refusal to participate in dysfunction. The narcissist will likely interpret your calm as weakness, but that's because they mistake chaos for strength. Real strength is containment. It's composure under provocation. It's knowing that your sense of worth is no longer up for negotiation. And this is why that simple sentence carries so much weight. It's not just a response, it's a stance. It represents the culmination of everything we've discussed: awareness of control, the power of boundaries, and the mastery of emotional neutrality. It's the moment where knowledge becomes action, where clarity becomes courage. So the next time someone tries to distort your truth, remember, you don't need to fight them in their world. You simply step out of it. You look them in the eye, grounded, calm, and say, "You're entitled to your opinion." Then you walk away, mentally, emotionally, spiritually free. Because the moment you no longer need to prove who you are, you become someone no narcissist can ever control again. When you really step back and look at the full picture, everything we've discussed comes down to one fundamental truth: freedom begins the moment you stop letting someone else define your sense of self. A narcissist can only control what you allow them to touch: your emotions, your attention, your need to be seen. The second you withdraw that access, the illusion of their power dissolves. They thrive on control, yes, but that control exists only in your reaction. The moment you stop reacting, they start to lose form. They depend on blurred boundaries to invade your emotional space, but when you draw a clear line and stand by it calmly, they're forced to face their own emptiness. And when you remain emotionally neutral, when you stop feeding their need for chaos, you reveal just how fragile their strength really is. That's where the one sentence, "You're entitled to your opinion," becomes so much more than words. It's a declaration of sovereignty. It's your quiet refusal to be pulled into a narrative that doesn't belong to you. You're not fighting them anymore. You're rising above them. You're stepping out of the psychological battlefield entirely. And what's left when you do that? Clarity, peace, strength that doesn't need to shout. You begin to see that the goal was never to defeat the narcissist. It was to free yourself from the cycle of reacting to them. You realize that power isn't about domination or control. It's about composure, integrity, and the ability to remain centered in truth even when someone else is trying to distort it. Every time you hold your boundary, every time you choose calm over chaos, you teach your mind something extraordinary. That safety doesn't come from control, it comes from self-respect. You stop living in the shadow of their ego and start living in alignment with your own values. That's not just emotional growth. That's transformation. And that's the lesson most people never reach. You don't have to destroy a narcissist to win. You only have to stop giving them the very thing they can't live without: your emotional engagement. Because when you stop reacting, you stop belonging to them. You reclaim your energy, your clarity, your dignity. So if there's one message to take from all of this, let it be this: you don't need to prove your worth to anyone who profits from your doubt. You don't need to win their approval to validate your truth. You only need to stand calmly and firmly in who you are. And when you do, when you choose peace over performance, self-respect over fear, truth over illusion, the narcissist's grip finally breaks. Not with drama, not with revenge, but with silence.